Under the burning sun, he found her, half-buried, broken, and begging for one last chance to live. The desert lay silent beneath the burning sky, heat shimmering above the red earth. Elias Boone rode slow, his horse's hooves sinking into dust that seemed never to end. He had no true destination, only the need to keep moving, to keep distance between himself and the memories that gnawed at him when the nights grew long. His coat bore the faded wear of countless miles, the brim of his hat frayed by storms and sun. To any eye, he was just another drifter, a man carved down to bone and silence by time. The wind shifted, carrying with it not just the dry whistle of sand, but something softer, fainter. At first, he thought it no more than a trick of his weary mind. But then it came again, ragged, fragile, a sound close to a moan. He pulled at the reins, horse snorting, ears flicking uneasily. Elias dismounted, boots sinking into the grit, and scanned the empty stretch of desert. And there, half hidden by the dune, he saw her. A woman, buried to the neck in sand. Skin blistered by the sun, lips cracked, eyes wild with a fury that trembled on the edge of despair. Her hair clung to her face in dusty strands, and the sight of her struck Elias with a stillness deeper than fear. Whoever had left her here meant for her to die slow. For a long moment, he stood, torn between turning away and stepping forward. He had sworn to himself long ago not to take on another burden. Yet something in her eyes, unyielding even in ruin, pulled at the part of him that had not yet turned to stone. With hands steady but reluctant, he knelt and began digging. The sand was heavy, clinging, but he worked in silence until her arms were freed, then her body. When at last she broke loose, she swayed, half collapsing against him, breath rattling weak from her chest. She spoke no thanks, no curse, only let the weight of her body lean into his, as though words had been beaten from her long before. He lifted her onto his horse and walked beside, leading them both toward the faint line of smoke that marked a town not far beyond the ridge. Each step seemed to press deeper into the choice he'd made, binding him to a fate he had not sought. By the time they reached the mining town, the sun was lowering, shadows stretched long across cracked boards and leaning shacks. He guided her into the main street, her figure slumped under his arm. But the reaction from the townsfolk was colder than the desert night. Heads turned, whispers stirred like dry grass in the wind. Some muttered her name, Clara Finch, though Elias did not yet know it. Eyes narrowed, mouths twisted. The words carried half in warning, half in judgment, betrayal, shame, punishment. He asked no questions. He only helped her into the saloon, where the barkeep glared but poured a basin of water nonetheless. She drank greedily, trembling, her shawl pulled tight as though it might shield her from their stares. Elias stood near, weathered hands resting on the back of a chair, taking in the weight of every eye fixed upon them. In that moment, he understood. This woman was not simply unwanted, she was cast out, a figure they had already buried once, and now resented to see alive. By standing with her, he felt the wall of their disdain closing on him too. Yet he did not move away. He had lived years in solitude, stripped of warmth and belonging. And now, in the silence between them, he recognized her as one marked by the same exile. Two strangers, bound not by trust but by abandonment, sitting in the fading light of a town that would rather see them gone. And so it began. The days that followed stretched slow and uneasy, like dust drifting in the late sun, heavy though without movement. Clara stayed mostly within the shelter Elias had found her, wrapped in a borrowed shawl someone had left at the edge of kindness. She spoke little, her voice a thread drawn too thin, and when she did it was only to ask for water, or to whisper of the fire being too low. Elias watched her from the edges of the room, as a man who had lived too long in silence will watch a sound he fears might vanish. The townsfolk had already judged her guilty, of what crime, he could not yet tell. Whispers clung to her name like thorns. She had once been the wife of a rancher, a stern man, a man no longer living. His death, they said, was stained with shadows. Some claimed Clara had a hand in it, others that her own kin had condemned her for pride, for disobedience, for stepping too far beyond a woman's place. Elias asked her nothing. He had learned the weight of silence himself, and he knew what it cost to carry it. At night she sat by the fire, the shawl drawn up to her chin, eyes reflecting the flames as though she stared into something far beyond them. Elias would sit across, nursing black coffee, the warmth bitter on his tongue. In her silence, he heard his own past, those long years after his wife had been buried, when the house echoed louder than any battlefield. He remembered the chair across from his rocking seat, empty, forever empty. The nights when he had spoken aloud, forgetting she was gone, then hearing nothing in reply but his own breath. Clara's presence stirred those shadows awake, though he buried the feeling as deep as he could. He would not name it. Not yet. But the town did not let him forget. The more she stayed, the sharper the whispers grew. When Elias stepped into the general store, voices hushed. When Clara walked across the street, children were pulled aside, eyes wide with the kind of fear taught, not born. A preacher's wife, her mouth pressed thin with duty, came to Elias one afternoon. She warned him, with words lined like scripture, that to shelter Clara was to invite ruin. Not only from those who judged her guilty but from the Apache, who some claimed had once protected her, even claimed her as kin. It is not safe, the woman said, eyes fixed on him as if he carried a sickness. Elias listened, but said little. The instinct in him to shield Clara only deepened, though it left him restless. When he returned to the cabin that night, he found her asleep in the firelight, her braid fallen loose against her cheek, one hand clutching the edge of the shawl like a lifeline. She did not stir when he entered, and for a moment, standing there, Elias felt the ache of recognition, a life stripped of mercy, yet clinging still to the dignity of breath. He thought then of how grief shapes a person, grinding them down until all that remains is the will to keep walking. In Clara's silence, in her refusal to defend herself, he saw a reflection of his own exile from love, the years when he had ceased expecting kindness and lived only in the rhythm of the road. Outside, the desert wind carried with it the restless murmur of the town. Inside, the fire whispered low, shadows swaying along the walls. Elias lowered himself into his chair, rifle leaning close at hand, and watched her as the flames softened. Whatever her past, whatever truths she held locked behind her eyes, she was here now, and for reasons he could not yet speak, that was enough. The storm announced itself long before it broke. All day the horizon had grown darker, clouds gathering low like a herd of black cattle pressing close together, restless and unyielding. By nightfall the air was heavy, close, smelling of dust and coming rain. Elias led Clara toward his cabin at the edge of town, his horse uneasy beneath the thick silence. The first strike of lightning split the sky as they crossed the rise, white against the dark like bone revealed under torn flesh. The rain came soon after, hard and sudden, drumming the earth until it turned to mud. By the time they reached the cabin, both were drenched, their clothes clinging heavy, boots slick with grit. Elias pushed the door open, the hinges protesting, and ushered Clara inside. She stood by the fire while he stoked it to life, shadows leaping long along the walls as if trying to escape the roar outside. The roof rattled, wind pushing through the eaves in a high, mournful whistle. They said little at first. Elias busied himself with hanging wet coats, setting kindling, pouring black coffee into tin cups. Clara sat wrapped in her shawl, eyes fixed on the flames, hair damp against her cheeks. Yet in the steady drum of rain, words began to spill from her, halting at first, then stronger, as though the storm outside had loosened the storm within. She told him she had once dreamed of freedom, of stepping beyond the fences her husband built around her life. For that yearning, she said, she had been branded unfaithful. She did not confess nor deny the whispers that dogged her name. What Elias heard was not guilt, but sorrow, the quiet shame of one who had reached for life and been punished for it. Lightning threw their shadows against the wall, tall and fragile both. Elias studied her hands as she spoke, hands scarred where rope had cut, trembling when she reached for the coffee pot, trying to steady it though the weight made her fingers shake. She noticed him watching and let the cup rest back in her lap, eyes lowering as though she feared pity more than hunger. The storm trapped them there for days. Creeks swelled until crossings were washed out, trees broke beneath the weight of wind, and the little cabin seemed the only island left standing. In that closeness, Elias saw her more clearly. She moved carefully about the room, as though wary of intruding, yet each small act, folding blankets, sweeping the corner near the door, setting water to boil, laid claim to life with a kind of fragile defiance. Clara, too, observed. She noticed the rocking chair by the window, placed as though waiting for someone who never returned. She saw the old tools, polished though rarely used, lined neatly against the wall. And she noticed the rifle, kept clean and oiled, though dust had gathered on the box of cartridges nearby. Each detail told her of a man who lived alone, guarding what remained though he no longer reached for more. Nights passed with the storm unrelenting, the wind screaming at the door as if demanding entry. They shared silence, and sometimes words, but always with the fire burning low between them. In that enforced solitude, the walls of distance began to shift, not broken, not yet, but thinned enough that each could see the wounds the other carried. When the rains at last began to ease, the land was changed, creeks swollen, tracks washed clean, branches scattered like bones. Within the cabin, something too had shifted, though it was as quiet and unseen as the roots that hold the earth together beneath the flood. Neither Elias nor Clara spoke of it aloud, but both carried the weight of knowing the storm had revealed more than it had destroyed. The days lengthened into uneasy weeks, and with each sunrise the air between them grew heavier. Elias kept himself to the work a man could not ignore, mending fences after the storm, chopping wood until the blisters broke, hauling water from the swollen creek. His shoulders bent to labor, though the rhythm of the axe and the pull of the rope could not still the thoughts stirring beneath his silence. Inside the cabin, Clara moved softly but with purpose. She swept the floor, tended the hearth, stitched at a torn sleeve with thread scavenged from an old tin. Each act seemed to carry weight, as if she believed her usefulness was the only thing standing between herself and being cast aside again. Yet the shadow of the town hung over her. The whispers did not end, they carried on the wind like smoke, clinging to every board of the cabin. She is poison. She will bring ruin. It was said low, but it was said enough. Elias noticed the change in her shoulders when she returned from the well. How she wrapped her shawl tighter when riders passed on the trail, spitting into the dirt as they glanced her way. He wanted to tell her not to mind them, but the words died in his throat. He himself felt their eyes when he went into town, the stairs sharp as nails, the air colder around him. It all came to a head one evening when the dust of the horizon brought with it a small band of riders. 5 men, weathered, shoulders squared by the conviction of those who believe themselves righteous. They pulled up at the cabin door, rifles resting casual but ready across their saddles. Their leader, a man with graying whiskers and a scar splitting his lip, leaned forward in the saddle. "You keepin' her here, Boone?" His voice cut like gravel. "You know what she is. You know what she brings. Send her out, or you'll bring their fire on us all. Apache won't forget. Neither will we." Elias stood steady in the doorway, his own rifle resting against the frame though not raised. He felt the weight of their stares pressing against his chest, sharp and accusing. Before he could answer, Clara stepped forward from the shadows of the cabin, her shawl clutched high at her throat. She did not cower, did not retreat. Her eyes burned as she stood in the doorway, the storm-dark clouds behind her. The men spat into the dirt, muttered curses, but did not force her. They turned after a silence that stretched too long, riding back into the dying light, their threats left behind like tracks in the sand. Elias watched them go, jaw clenched, hands tight around nothing. That night, the cabin was quieter than it had ever been. Clara sat by the fire, her face drawn, the shawl still about her shoulders as though it might shield her from his gaze. Her voice broke the silence, sharp, cutting. "You keep me here out of pity. Like a stray you cannot send back to the wild." Elias turned from the table, his hands resting heavy on the wood. "You keep yourself hidden. You expect a man to carry your silence without knowing what it means. The word struck hard between them, louder than the wind clawing at the roof. She turned away, the firelight glinting off the tears she refused to let fall before him. He returned to his chair, shoulders heavy, the crackle of the flames filling what they could not. Later, long after the embers had dulled, Elias lay awake listening to the roof creak in the wind. From across the room came a sound softer than the storm, a stifled sob, muffled by the shawl she pressed to her face. He closed his eyes, and the sound carved deeper into him than any knife. He did not rise to comfort her, though every part of him ached to. He only lay still, the silence between them wide as the desert, yet filled now with the weight of something neither of them dared name. The alarm came with the crack of a rifle in the night, followed by the rising scream of a woman carried on the wind. Elias was on his feet before the echo faded, pulling his boots on, hand closing around the rifle by the door. Clara followed him out, her shawl clutched to her shoulders, eyes wide in the flicker of orange light against the horizon. Flames licked at the sky where the nearest farmstead lay, the fire spreading fast across dry timbers. The sound of horses, of shouting, of another volley of shots split the darkness. Elias mounted quickly, pulling Clara up behind him despite her protest. They rode hard across the open stretch, the horses' hooves hammering the earth, smoke thickening as they neared the burning homestead. Shadows moved in the light of the blaze, raiders, swift and merciless, driving cattle, overturning barrels, firing into the air to scatter resistance. He dismounted, pulling Clara to cover, then stepped into the chaos without hesitation. His rifle spoke, measured and cold, each shot precise. He moved with the grim silence of a man who had no taste for killing but had carried it before, and would again if pressed. The fire roared, sparks lifting into the black sky, heat pressing close against his skin. Clara crouched behind a toppled wagon, her breath ragged. Then she saw it, a raider circling behind Elias, rifle raised, his back turned. Without thought, she seized the rifle that had fallen from a dead man's grasp, her hands trembling, unfamiliar with its weight. The wood was slick, the barrel cold, yet her aim was steady enough. She fired. The shot rang true. The man fell before he could pull the trigger. Elias turned, startled, eyes locking on her. For an instant he saw not the woman whispered of as cursed, not the figure buried in sand and silence, but a soul unbroken by all attempts to destroy her. The firelight caught her face, fierce in its resolve, and something within him shifted. When the raiders fled, driven back into the night, the farmstead lay in ruins, smoke rising, walls blackened, the land scorched. Elias moved among the wreckage, steadying those who had survived, offering what little he could. And Clara, still gripping the rifle though her hands shook, stood apart in silence. By dawn, when the last embers dimmed and the land lay hushed in ruin, Elias found her by the fence, her shawl torn, soot streaking her face. He took the rifle gently from her hands, prying her fingers loose one by one, and saw how raw the skin was, how the tremor would not leave her. He guided her to a stump by the road and sat with her, the light pale and thin across the land. It was then she spoke, voice low, cracked not from smoke but from memory. She told him of her husband, a man whose hand was heavier than his word, whose cruelty was hidden behind the walls of their home. She had tried to flee, and for that, she said, her own kin turned against her, burying her in sand for the dishonor of disobedience. They called me faithless, she whispered, staring at her raw palms. But I only wanted to live. She did not look at him as she spoke, nor ask him to believe. She only set the words free, as though carrying them any longer would break her. Elias listened in silence, his chest tight with a weight he could not put into words. When her voice faltered, he reached out. His hand, rough with years of labor, touched her face gently, brushing back the hair matted with soot. Her skin was lined by sun and wind, scarred in places, yet her eyes held the same defiance he had seen in the firelight, unyielding, even in ruin. For the first time since he had buried his wife, Elias felt a stirring not born of memory but of the present, of trust earned in the blaze of danger, of something raw and unspoken tying them together. The fire between them was not of desire alone, but of survival, of two souls choosing, even for a moment, not to walk alone in the ash. The dawn spread slow, smoke drifting thin against the rising sky. Around them, the land bore its wounds, but in the quiet between heartbeats, Elias knew that something had been salvaged, something small, but alive. The news spread faster than the smoke had cleared. By the next day, whispers carried across the valley, twisting into judgments before they ever reached Elias's door. Clara was no longer just the shamed woman buried in sand, now she was spoken of as dangerous, a mark upon the settlement, her defiance sure to draw Apache vengeance. By late afternoon, the sound of hooves broke the stillness around the cabin. A knot of settlers rode in hard, their faces taut with anger and fear. Elias stepped out onto the porch, rifle across his arm, calm but unyielding. Clara stood in the doorway behind him, shawl drawn close, though her eyes were steady. "Send her away," one of the men said, his voice cutting the cold air. "You know what she is. Trouble follows her. Keep her here, and you put all of us in the ground." Others muttered agreement, some spitting curses, their gazes fixed on Clara as if she were a curse made flesh. The air thickened with threat, but Elias did not move. Before he could speak, another sound came, the shrill call of riders above. Heads turned to the ridge where a small band of Apache scouts had appeared, their silhouettes stark against the pale sky. They did not charge, nor lift their weapons. They only watched, their presence heavy as stone. A tension like stretched wire bound the air. Elias felt every eye upon him, settlers behind, Apaches before, and Clara in the center of it all. He raised his rifle, but not to fire. He held it at his side, steady, a man making a stand not for war but for the dignity of someone the world had cast aside. No words were exchanged across the distance. The Apaches did not descend. The settlers did not press forward. Instead, Clara moved. She stepped past Elias, her braid slipping loose over her shoulder, her face unmasked. She did not plead, nor bow her head. She stood where all could see her, letting the silence judge her as it would. Then she turned, slow and deliberate, and walked to Elias's horse. When she placed her hand on its reins, she did so not with apology but with claim. She mounted, waiting for him without once lowering her gaze. The settlers shifted uneasily. Some turned their eyes aside, shamed by what they had demanded. Others muttered under their breath, spitting her name as though it were ash. But none stepped forward. On the ridge, the Apaches watched a moment longer, then turned their horses and slipped back into the horizon, leaving only dust where they had been. Elias mounted beside her. Together, without a word, they rode past the men who had come to cast her out. The only sound was the creak of saddle leather, the steady breath of their horse, and the whisper of wind moving through the bare trees. The land was scarred, fences broken, smoke still drifting from the charred remains of the farmstead. Yet as they rode, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Soft, slow, weightless, they drifted down across the blackened earth, covering ruin with a thin veil of white. The world seemed to pause, caught between ash and silence. Clara leaned against him then, not as a woman defeated but as one choosing to go forward. Her weight was not a burden but a quiet trust. For Elias, it was as if something long locked away had loosened, the widow's grief that had kept him hollow giving way to something fragile, unspoken, but alive. He looked across the plains as snow gathered on the horizon, settling into the furrows of land and memory alike. It was not promise, nor forgiveness, but a reprieve, earned not by the world's acceptance, but by their choice to endure it together. The horse carried them on, leaving only 2 tracks through the white. Behind them lay judgment, ahead only the wide, unmarked silence of the frontier. And in that silence, for the first time in many years, Elias felt he was not walking it alone.